What is framework and its purpose? The framework is intended to serve as a blueprint for users to create processes that provide at a bare minimum a way to store, interpret, and easily change project configuration data, as well as robust exception handling scheme and event logging for all exceptions and related transaction information. The system logs messages at each relevant stage in the process of resolving a business transaction and sends those logs to the orchestrator server. This in turn can be linked to the ELK stack, which is Elasticsearch, Logstack, and Kibana platform, which allows for data storage and a variety of different ways to represent the data. The purpose of our framework is to resolve a set of business transactions. A transaction is a small amount of data and the steps needed to process it to complete a segment of business process. A process that reads a single email from a mailbox and extracts data from it is a good example. What is a business process? The sum of actions by which the data required for a series of transactions is collected, processed, and input into or out of an IT resource is referred to as a business process. We can classify business process into three groups based on the steps involved and how they are repeated. Linear. The steps of linear process are only done once, and if different data needs to be processed, the automation must be run again. Iterative. The steps of iterative process are repeated several times, but different data items are used every time. Transactional. Transactional systems like iterative process have steps that replicate several times over various data objects. What is ReFramework? The Robotic Enterprise Framework is a state machine-based project template. The template includes several ready-to-use state containers for launching applications, retrieving data, processing it, and closing the transaction. These states are linked together by a series of transactions that cover almost every requirement in a typical automation scenario. Several workflows have been triggered, each of which deals with a different aspect of project. It's designed to incorporate all of the industry's best practices for logging, exception management, application initialization, and other areas, showing it to handle even the most complex business situations. Let's look at the features of ReFramework. The three features are settings, logging, and business application exception. Settings. During the initialization phase of several processes, some configuration settings and configuration values are frequently read, like URLs to the web application, orchestrator queue names, and default logging messages. The ReFramework maintains a track of this information by reading it from a configuration file and storing it in a different dictionary object shared by all states. Instead of updating workflows directly, this provides a simple way to manage projects by adjusting values in the configuration file. Logging. The built-in logging mechanism is another helpful feature of ReFramework. The majority of system workflows use log message activities to output information about what is happening at each stage of execution. This can be used to not only identify problems and aid in the debugging process, but also to generate visualization and reports about the process execution, like how many invoices are handled every day, how many failures occur, and what are the critical causes of this failure. Business and application execution. There may be conditions that occur during the execution of most processes that are not part of the usual execution flow and must be resolved to achieve more efficient automation. If the issue can be resolved by restarting application, the framework will do so automatically and attempt to process the transaction again. Such exceptions are known as application exception. If the issue is with the data or an underlying business requirement, the system skips the transaction and moves to the next. Such exceptions are known as business exception. Let's look at the ReFramework architecture. The ReFramework is implemented as a state machine, which is a form of workflow with two advantageous characteristics: states and transitions. Actions to be taken in response to the stated input are described by states. Transitions that switch the execution from one state to another based on the results of the state. There are 4 key states in ReFramework, that is initial state, get transaction data, process transaction, and end process. Initial state, initialization, this is the point at which the procedure begins. It's an event where the process initializes the settings and runs application tests to ensure that all of the prerequisites for the process start are met. So initialization transitions. So there are 2 transitions, system exception and successful. When a system error is not nothing, it gets transitioned to the end process. If we have an application exception during the initialization phase, we don't have enough details to start the process. As a result, we are going to the end process state to wrap it up. Successful. When a system error is nothing, it gets transitioned to get transaction data. If during the initialization we have no error, then we go to the get transaction data. The next state is the get transaction state. This state retrieves the next transaction object. This can be a queue item or a collection item. Transaction items are queue items by default, but this can be modified to meet your needs. This is also the state where the developer can set the condition to exit the state when there are no items to process. Get transaction data transitions. There are 2 transitions, no data and new transaction. No data, if the transaction item is nothing, then we are at the end of our data collection, so we go to the end process. New transaction data. If the transaction item contains data, then we process it. Next state is the process transaction state. The process transaction state, for the transaction item obtained in the previous step, it performs actions and applies logic in various applications. If a transaction item has been processed, the process moves on to the next transaction item that is available. So there are 3 process transaction transitions: success, business exception, and system exception. In success, if the condition is business rule exception is nothing and system error is nothing, then the transition to get transaction data. If there is a business rule exception, it is logged and we move on to the next transition. Business exception. If the business rule exception is not nothing, then it gets transitioned to get transaction data. If we have a business rule exception, we log it and move to the next transaction by going to the get transaction data state. System exception. If we have an application exception, we close all programs, kill them if they fail to complete, take a screenshot at the moment the exception happened and go to init, where we reinitialize our working environment and begin a new form of transaction that has failed. And finally, we have the end process state. The procedure is completed and the application opened during the automation are closed in the end process state. Since this is the last state, the final state, there are no transition available in the end process state. We'll explore each one of the states in detail in the demo. Let's see the demo now. In this demo, we will see how to dispatch data from the Excel file. Then we will create queue items and process these items. And then we will understand the working of each state in the Robotic Enterprise framework in detail. So let's get started. First, we'll go to the orchestrator and create a queue. Enter cloud platform.ui. Sign up, then go to the orchestrator, the tenant which you have created. Select the folder context, go to the folder context, and you can see queues here. Go to the queues and you can see an option to add here. Click on add and enter a queue name. I'll enter it as REF. Enter any description if you want. Give unique reference yes and add. And you can see a queue is been added. So you can add an asset as well. To add an asset, you can go to add, click here add, and enter the asset name. And select the type, whatever is required, say boolean. Let by default be it as false. Then create So this is how you create an asset. So let's go to the UiPath Studio. So what we are basically doing is we are building two processes. One to feed a queue in the orchestrator, that is a dispatcher process, and one to process transaction from the queue, that is using the robotic enterprise framework. So in dispatcher process, what we do is we get entries from an Excel file and add them as a queue items in the orchestrator. We have already created a queue. We started project as a sequence and added a try catch. We started with the sequence, added a try catch activity in the try block. We used a read range activity to read first 10 lines from A1 to C11 from an Excel file and store them in a newly created data table variable. We used for each row to loop through the rows of the data table variable and add each of them in a queue using the add queue item activity. Then we used a log message. We used log message activity to log the fact that the dispatching process was successful. That is how we created the dispatcher process. Now we'll create a performer using robotic enterprise framework. What it does is it gets items from the queue and processes them. So in the dispatcher process, let's go to the initialization state first. So we'll understand initialization state in detail. So the entire init block is kept inside the try catch. If you go to the documents here, and if you go to the data folder, you can see a config file here. So config file, this is the file we use in the init state. It has three sheets: settings, constants, and assets. You can give any values whatever you want. For maximum retry number, the value should be 0. When you're working with the orchestrator queues, the value should be 0. So this config file is stored in the data folder. And it has three sheets: settings, constants, and assets. This is the queue name, process ABC queue. So let's get back to the framework. So we are initializing system error. If the error is nothing, it will go to the next state. If first run read local configuration file. You can see by default there are many variables created. You should know them and utilize them whenever required. The config variable, the value type is dictionary type. Config is nothing. If you go here, you can see here config is nothing. Initially there is no value, so initially config is nothing. Then it will invoke init all settings workflow. Let's open this first run. So it will invoke init all settings workflow. To see this workflow, click on open workflow. It has three arguments. In config file, in config sheets, and out config. This is of type string, and out config is of type dictionary. And direction, this is both are input and this is out. Let's open the workflow and understand. So basically what this workflow does is, this workflow outputs a setting dictionary with a key value pairs to be used in the project. Settings are referred from the local config file and then fetched from the orchestrator assets. Assets will override the config file settings. Init all settings workflow invoke to initialize all settings and data for application and process used. In this part, the setting constant and assets in the config file from the data folder are read in the initialize all settings. So let's go back. If the orchestrator queue name from the configuration file in the argument case is specified, then it provides a backward compatibility. Next we have invoke kill process. If we go to the arguments here, we can see the orchestrator queue name. You can assign a queue name here if you have created a queue. So invoke kill process. Next we have invoke kill process. It is a logging activity called killing process. Depending on the project, you can add activity. It is a logging activity called killing process. Depending on the project, you can add activities. Add log fields. In add log fields, if you want to add any details in the log file, then you can do it using all log fields. Init all applications. Workflow. In this workflow, invoke to open apps and check the status, credentials, and so on. And that there are two transitions in this. When it is successful, it gets transition to get transaction data. When there is a system exception, it goes to the end process. So in short, what initialization state does is, at the end of this workflow, that is the initialization state, it reads the config file and stores the key and value inside the dictionary. That is the out config. Out config dictionary variable has all config Excel file data. Let's see the get transaction data. When you are in the orchestrator and you want to immediately stop a job for some reason, when the job is stopped, this activity gets activated. There is a variable created should stop. If it's a boolean variable, by default it's false. When it gets activated, the value becomes yes. Then it will go to the log stop message as stop process requested. And it will end the process when the transaction item is nothing. Else it will go to the try get transaction data. Here it has 7 arguments. And let's see the workflow. Invoke get transaction data workflow. Click on open workflow. It gets the data from the spreadsheets, databases, email, web API, or UiPath server queues. If no new data items, then set out the transaction item to nothing. If a new transaction item is retrieved, then it gets the additional information about it. It gives the condition where out transaction item is not nothing, then it will add the transaction information to the log fields. It is about the get transaction data workflow. In process transaction state, the process is a sequence with a try catch activity set to catch both system exceptions and business exceptions. Inside the try block, the process transaction workflow invoke that has simple process like to attach the UI demo application and 3 type intro activities to fill in and click accept button. And if you see, look at the transitions, it has 3 transitions: system exception, whose destination is the initialization state; business exception, goes back to the get transaction data; and success, it goes to the get transaction data. Finally, the end process state where the application is closed.